Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another exciting Authors at Google event. Today, we're pleased to host Ian McNeely, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Oregon. Together with his wife, Lisa Wolverton, they have written a book which focuses on the history of ideas and information storage and retrieval from the ancient times to the modern day. Lisa's work focuses on the socio-political history of Czechoslovakia, and especially during the Middle Ages, while Ian focuses more on modern post-revolutionary history. Both have won numerous awards on their own, and they've combined forces to produce what I think is a really outstanding book. Especially since it mentions Google right on page one. The topic of the book is actually reinventing knowledge from Alexandria to the internet, and so it focuses on ways that we've really captured knowledge throughout the ages. Throughout history, people have sought ways to transfer knowledge from generation to generation. You could even say that these events, like the Library of Alexandria, Diderot's Encyclopedia, Google, Wikipedia, they all aim for the same goal. You could call it, organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful, depending on the century you're in. So if that sounds familiar, that's great. That's why you're here. It's nothing new that we here at Google are working to usher in a similar revolution in ideas in the modern day. And so as we go forward, we can look on Ian and Lisa's book as to gain clues from the past. Now, so for the benefit of our YouTube and virtual audiences, at the end of our talk, we'll have time for some question and answering. Please use the Q&A mics, and then towards the end, Ian will also be available to sign copies of the book and for any questions you might have after the talk. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ian McNeely.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Google for having me down from Eugene today. I want to thank all of you individually for coming to see me, and those are on the virtual audiences as well. Any future audiences on YouTube, I thank them in advance. I'd like to thank my wife and co-author, Lisa Wolverton. We wrote this book over 6 years of dinner conversations and raising 2 children, and they wouldn't be here without her help as well. The origins of this book go back to the mid-1980s when it was that I first conceived the ambition of becoming the math and computer god of East Side High School in Gainesville, Florida, and then on that basis to begin building a computing empire of truly global proportions. After all, I had an Apple II Plus computer configured with 48K of RAM, jury-rigged to make it seem like 64. It had a 6502 microprocessor, which ran at 1 megahertz. For those of you who don't know, that's 1 million cycles per second. It had a floppy disk drive with a 5¼ inch floppy, 180K. You could flip the thing over, take a hole punch, defeat the write protection feature, and turn that into 360K. I was all set. And indeed, by 1986, I was well on my way to realizing my dream. It was in that year that, even though I was a junior in high school, I enrolled as in a calculus class normally reserved for seniors. I'm the dour-looking guy in the Harvard shirt. And I thought, as I said, that I was well on my way. Despite those ambitions, however, I soon realized that I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. There were others younger than I, more mathematically gifted, more computationally savvy than I. Not only in that calculus class was there a sophomore who was also taking along with us, but also a freshman, an upstart, fresh out of middle school, who indeed would go on to become the math and computer god of East Side High School in Gainesville, Florida, and to help at least in building a computing empire of truly global proportions. That young man standing to my right in the picture is Google employee number 1, Craig Silverstein, and currently your director of technology. So my ambitions in life were derailed by Craig. I realized quite soon that to attain any measure of success, I would have to change from computers to the humanities and vindicate our traditions of literary, philosophical, and religious inquiry against the celebrants of high technology and scientific utopianism. Though I should add that Craig, when he aced both the math and the verbal sections of the SAT, bested me on that front as well. Reinventing knowledge is the culmination of that turn I took way back in the late 1980s. The turn detour into history after I consciously abandoned computer science. The book is not actually a history of schemes to organize and preserve and transmit information or even knowledge. It's not a catalog of great ideas and the thinkers who thought them. It's not a repository of technological innovation. I spent a lot of time talking about people who weren't very innovative, technologically speaking. I don't pretend to offer any new insights on the history of the internet itself. Instead, my ambition, as Craig himself put it on the blurb in the back of the book, on the back cover, is to show that, quote, the knowledge revolution brought on by the internet is not the first such revolution or even the biggest. In fact, as I argue in the book, and you can see this right in the table of contents, there have been 6, and only 6, such revolutions in the 2,300-year history of what we now call Western civilization. And each such basically each chapter in the book, each revolution, each reinvention as I call it, is associated with the emergence of a new institution of knowledge. When I say institution, I don't want you to think of like a mental hospital. I want you to think of big things like marriage, the institution of property, huge things that are really beyond the control of even the greatest of creative minds, the greatest of geniuses, but that structure the way we pursue knowledge, what we do in order to obtain knowledge, to pass it down, why we pursue knowledge, what ends, what goals we hope to achieve out of so doing. And my argument is that each institution has been associated with a particular historical epoch, and that at the beginning of each of these epochs was a sort of window of opportunity when small groups of people and even individuals could cast a prototype, a model, from which later instances of that institution were cloned, even if they did change many of their basic features. And that this would happen over and over again throughout an epoch of history until a new institution, obeying a different logic and purpose, came to reinvent what it meant to pursue knowledge. You'll notice that the internet is not one of these institutions. Far be it from me to come to the belly of the beast and tell you that what you're doing is not creative. That is not at all what I'm saying. Einstein doesn't even make it into this book because his contributions happen to fit within the institution of the laboratory. What I believe is that the internet, Google, YouTube, Facebook, all the things we now rightly perceive as a revolution of some kind in knowledge, those things don't amount to a reinvention. But I still do believe that we're living in dramatic times, and by the end of the talk today, I want to offer some speculations about what the future of knowledge portends in our own lifetimes. Excuse me. So, I'd like to begin with the most ancient institution, the library. The prototype for which, as is well known, is the library at Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE to collect all the world's learning. We now find this a totally natural goal. The idea of collecting all the knowledge in the world is a laudable one, a logical one, one worthy of emulation in our own day. But at the time, it represented a profound rupture with, even a betrayal of, the intellectual culture from which it sprang, that of classical Athens. Recall that classical Greece was a world of the city-state, of the democratic polis, of a place where face-to-face interaction, where argument and debate and philosophizing in the town square was the coin of the realm. And it was not at all a prized thing to do to commit these oral debates to writing. Plato had begun to do so with his dialogues. Aristotle had moved even farther in that direction, but it was the founder of the Library of Alexandria, one Demetrius of Phaleron, who dyed his hair blonde and wore makeup and had affairs with married women and adolescent boys, and who in a political scandal fled Greece to help build this new library at Alexandria. What I'm arguing, and this happens every time an institution is reinvented, is that the new institution changes the practices of pursuing knowledge, the ways it's pursued. In this case, from speech to writing. And in particular, from the democratic speech of the classical Athenian polis to writing and written scholarship, which became the benchmark for intellectual activity for centuries to come. Why did this happen, I argue, has to do with the political shift from polis to empire, from democracy to empire. The library at Alexandria served the political ends of the men who founded the city of Alexandria, naming it after Alexander the Great. These were men who were his generals and wished to show the world that they were more than generals. They were not just warlords or thugs. They were patrons of learning. And indeed, they wanted to import Greek culture to wherever the military men had managed to establish an outpost, to show by rendering oral knowledge written that it could be taken anywhere and used to sort of hold up to illustrate the superiority of Greeks over Persians, over Egyptians, and so on. And that was the function of the library at Alexandria, much less idealistic than we might like to think. An example you see here is the so-called Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which has since entered the patrimony of Jewish history itself. The Septuagint is so named after 72 scholars, 6 for each tribe of Israel, were commissioned by the directors of the library at Alexandria to translate the Hebrew holy books into Greek. And when, by legend at least, all 72 came up with the exact same translation, it was held, this obviously is a divinely sanctioned text. But in reality, the Septuagint served not the interests of the Jews, but those of the Greeks who ruled over them. The Jews were a powerful minority, a wealthy and influential one, but not yet one that was willing to commit its loyalties to the Greek overlords. The Greek overlords determined they would essentially cozy up to the Jewish minority by ruling them by their own laws. And darned if they didn't have a lot of those. They needed to render those laws into Greek so that they could understand and thereby rule them. So the second point I'd like to make is that each institution not only provides new ways or practices of knowing, but also a new purpose for knowing. That purpose in the case of the library was political, empire building. In the case of the monastery, which succeeded it, it was very different. It was a religious or spiritual quest. Every monastery, as you may know, contains a certain number of books. Nothing like the Library of Alexandria, but books nonetheless, written scholarship, produced in a scriptorium, an example of which I'm showing you here. The monastery, like the library, stored books, but did so as a means of interpreting the Word of God, understanding the Gospels of Jesus Christ, and all these things trumped the secular and political mission of the library, which led many monks literally to rub out precious parchment texts inherited from antiquity in order to inscribe new spiritual and religious teachings upon them. So what appears to us to be an instance of vandalism is shown on the left, a palimpsest, which is simply a piece of parchment that has been written over, in some cases rubbed out, in some cases only imperfectly rubbed out. You take, this is our only extant copy of Cicero's De Republica, on the Republic. The monkish scholars who acquired this parchment didn't even have enough respect for it to preserve it. Instead, they inscribed upon it St. Augustine's commentary on the Psalms. Now, we often think of the so-called Dark Ages as a period when monasteries tried and failed to preserve the legacy of ancient learning, and in some cases failed so miserably that they couldn't even betake themselves to slaughter a new animal and harvest its skin for parchment. Really, what I want to argue is that the monks knew exactly what they were doing. They preserved and reproduced only those texts which served either primarily or secondarily their spiritual quest, and that we therefore should not judge them by their failure to preserve the legacy of antiquity. My next lesson or point is that new institutions of knowledge coalesce only in response to epochal, historic, major social changes. They respond, in other words, to the needs of society and not to the needs, at least in the first instance, of scholars themselves. And the best example of that is the third institution, the university, or universitas, by its Roman Latin name. And so the dynamic here is this. Whereas the monastery formed originally amidst the collapse of ancient civilization, the collapse of the Roman Empire, the university responded to the revival of civilization in Western Europe, another large-scale social change. And its purpose was not to secure academic freedom. It was not an ivory tower. The first universitates in places like Paris and Bologna in Italy were not there to secure freedom for scholars, but instead to provide vocational training for lawyers, for doctors, and for theologians, or for preachers, or for people who practiced religious teaching. And indeed, the word universitas simply means corporation in Latin. It could be translated also as guild or trade union. You could refer to the universitas of butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers just as easily as you could refer to the universitas of lawyers, doctors, and theologians. It was a guild. It wasn't an institution for academic freedom. It responded to the West's first knowledge economy, the burgeoning economy of 12th century Europe, which had need of these vocations. One corollary to this argument is that institutions do not respond to changes in the content of knowledge. Great ideas, big thinkers, scientific revolutions all play out within institutions and do not in any case, with some exceptions, lead to the production of an entirely new institution of knowledge. If institutions reflect the demands of societies around them and strike a balance between the interests of thinkers and scholars and pursuers of knowledge, then those pursuers of knowledge to some extent play by the rules set by the society that calls these institutions into being. The best illustration I can give of the fact that institutions contain scientific revolutions and are not produced or do not change in response to them is the big one itself, the scientific revolution of the Renaissance, led by men like Copernicus and Galileo, who famously proved that the Earth, let me see if I can get this right, the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. This revolution played out entirely within a new institution called the Republic of Letters, which is the only one in the table of contents that I'm wagering you've probably never heard of before. And that institution was not created to produce scientific ideas or discoveries by any means. The institution of the Republic of Letters was a handwritten correspondence network. It was a network without nodes. It resembled the internet in the sense that people all over Europe could write letters to one another. And there are a couple people like Nicolas Claude Fabry de Perez who were like servers, whose job it was not so much to produce new ideas themselves, so much as to act as relay points and nodes where people could send in their information via letter and then have that fan out across to scholars all over Europe. Why did they all of a sudden begin writing letters? Why did they then draw on the rhetorical techniques of ancient Latin to spice up their letters with pretty rhetorical flourishes that to us today seem unbelievably frilly and even humiliating? The reason was that the universities had lost their monopoly on learning. One of the main objectives of the universities I showed, the Universitas, was to produce scholars of religion. When the Protestant Reformation came along, there were all of a sudden two versions of that Christian religion, Protestantism and Catholicism. Actually, there were many more, but those were the two big ones. And when universities became riven by that conflict in the larger society, then they lost the ability to speak for the entirety of Christendom, for the entire body of people committed to the Christian faith. Universities continued to proliferate. They grew in huge numbers because, after all, all the Protestants and the Catholics needed to produce ideological boot camps. But this cracked down on whatever freedom there did exist within the university to share knowledge, and as a result, those who were committed to some kind of ecumenical dialogue took to the medium of handwritten letters and later to other media to make their inventions and ideas known. As I said, this wasn't originally founded as a forum in which to produce new information, simply to discuss old truths, but it soon became repurposed, hijacked, if you will, by those like Copernicus and Galileo, who realized that the handwritten letter was a perfect medium for circumventing the shop-worn orthodoxies of university scholars and their political patrons. Orthodoxies such as the idea that the earth is the decrepit center of the universe, the locus of dirtiness and sin, and it's surrounded by the celestial planets and ultimately enclosed by God himself. This was a nice theological argument, fit in well with the universities and the power structure, but it was upended by scholars in the Republic of Letters. And you can see an example here of Galileo, who often wrote to his patrons in again, using these kind of, I'm your most humble servant, your most exalted excellency, allow me to tell you what I've been doing lately. He draws some pictures, you can see the little stars, the asterisks there, of Jupiter's moons. I've discovered these new things. Who knew that Jupiter, this perfect celestial orb, has little things revolving around it, which seem to be miniature planets themselves? You can find out about it in my next letter. So that is the lesson of the Republic of Letters. One big lesson is always to expect surprises, especially where information technology is concerned. As knowledge accumulated during the scientific revolution and later during the 18th century Enlightenment, the Republic of Letters, as I've already mentioned briefly, spawned new media to magnify the effect of handwritten letters. You could only copy the things so many times. And so you began to find new forums where genuine breakthroughs could be vetted and discovered. You had museums founded, for example, to collect wondrous objects pouring in from the New World. For some reason, people were fascinated with embalmed crocodiles. And every so-called Wunderkammer, cabinet of curiosities in Europe, had to have at least one embalmed crocodile, because these animals were not known, generally speaking, in Western Europe. You could go to a museum and see those, or chunks of coral were also fantastically popular. This is a place where you could finally see and not just read in a letter about wondrous new discoveries. Learned academies were another venue where you could see face-to-face demonstrations. They disproved the old saw that nature abhors a vacuum by taking a bird and putting it under a glass and evacuating all the air out of it. And when the bird suffocated and struggled and died, they would say, this is the beauty of science. We've proven something new. But the printed book was by far the most novel information medium spawned by the Republic of Letters. The printed book was theoretically democratic in its reach. It could fan out all over Europe and beyond to the Americas, and it became the repository of the dreams of those who sought to revisit the precedents set by the scholars at ancient Alexandria, namely to collect and to disseminate all the world's learning and to do something unprecedented, which was to make that learning publicly available for the benefit of anyone who could read. This is something the very elitist scholars who worked in the library at Alexandria had never even attempted to do. The printed book was the high-tech information medium of the 18th century. And with the French encyclopédie, the French encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert, we have here an attempt to gather together a dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers, a dictionary of all the arts, sciences, and even the artisanal crafts, presented in attractive copperplate illustration. So for example, if you were a country lawyer or a provincial nobleman, you would subscribe to the encyclopedia, and even though you might actually do this, you might actually not do this, you would be fascinated by the possibility. You could read in the pages, you look up M for mine, and you can build a coal mine in your backyard, complete with illustrations on how to do this. The idea was that anyone could use this encyclopedia to obtain knowledge. They even, at the end of every article, provided links to other articles of interest. And so I'm stealing another historian's example here, but the one on the Eucharist, which is the Catholic sacrament where you consume the body and blood of Christ in the form of a cracker and some wine, had a nice little hyperlink to the article on anthropophagy, which is the same thing as eating a person, a cannibal. So it was a way of sort of getting a dig in at the Catholic Church. This is what you're doing. But the principle of hyperlinks could be applied to any article in the encyclopedia. It was all interconnected into a giant web. Now, as we all know, this encyclopedic experiment succeeded brilliantly. Every one of us, I'm sure, as soon as we turn 18 and finish high school, we procure a set of quality encyclopedias and we head out into the world. Or now we're given a computer with a Google search box at the very top, and we're good to go. That's obviously not the case. And what we're talking about here is yet another reinvention of knowledge, which disappointed the expectations of the most progressive, most modern, most scientifically minded scholars in the Republic of Letters. It was the rejuvenation of the medieval university in an entirely new form and coming out of a very odd quarter. In the 1700s, the universities had sunk so low that they were widely regarded as places for students to go get drunk. And if they didn't like the professors, they might physically assault them and throw them in the nearest river. And many of the professors deserved this treatment because they were still mired in the pedantry of the medieval system. It was not in France, which was the sort of harbinger of modernity. It was not in England, which was the bellwether of industrial capitalism. It was in backward, provincial, fragmented Germany that the universities, these cesspools of alcoholism, became the site of an entirely unpredicted revolution in knowledge. And the leaders of this revolution were evangelical Protestants. Historically speaking, adherents of religion are the main people who seek to bring knowledge not only to the upper classes, not only to the middle classes, but to the poorest of the poor. Protestants in particular had an evangelical mission to teach the lowest of the low how to read the Bible because that was the means of salvation. And it was Protestants who occupied the universities. They transformed them into the germs of our first systems of mass public education, primary, secondary, and eventually tertiary. And when they left off, where the Bible thumpers left off, scholars of classical Greek and Latin, other sort of backward-looking holdovers, took up the cause. So the seminaries that the Protestants created became the seminars that the classical Greek and Latin scholars then repurposed, and these seminars became the seedbed for every discipline. Whether that be theology, whether that be classics, whether that be history, whether that be even chemistry, psychology, etc. Anyone who's been to grad school has had this experience in one form or another. And so the pendulum swung back from writing in the Republic of Letters, the printed book, to speech. And the medieval universitas was reinvented not as an occupational guild for those seeking vocational training, but as a haven for pure and disinterested academic research. The reason was that the seminar allowed people who were interested in arcane and bizarre topics like Russian literature or chemical physics to gather together in small rooms and essentially to socialize and to specialize and to egg each other on. And that proved much more effective as a human face-to-face interaction, much more effective in generating knowledge than reclining as a country lawyer or a provincial nobleman with your encyclopedia, which might teach you something interesting but not actually induce you to build that mind. And the result is what we today call the research university. So even though it has the same name, roughly speaking, as the medieval universitas, the research university today and all the liberal arts colleges who draw their faculties from research universities is a creature of the disciplines, all the majors and all the ologies that you may remember from college. So my argument, there's a strong version and a weak version of the book's argument. The weak version is that there's this series of institutions, 6 of them in however many hundred years. The strong version is that each institution has superseded its predecessor. Each old institution still continues to exist, don't get me wrong. But whenever a new institution comes along, it reforms and reshapes the practices of knowing and of learning in such a way that all of the others become subordinate to it. So take a look at the first pair. The monastery and the library both held books. But the monastery transformed a library from a place to project political power into a mere storehouse of books that could be used for whatever purpose the larger parent institution dictates to it. In this case, the pursuit of religion. And that's the function libraries still have today. University and the monastery, a different pattern. The university left the monastery untouched. You can still enter a monastery and read the same types of texts, the Rule of St. Benedict, for example, that you would have 1,000 years ago. But the university arrogated from the monastery its function of producing religious teachers, its theology graduates, and it added other functions besides, like the training of doctors and the training of lawyers. The Republic of Letters, as we've seen, circumvented the universities when they became ideological battlegrounds between Protestants and Catholics. But the Republic was circumvented in its own turn by scholars who re-inhabited the universities, reinvented and redesigned them, and created the disciplines which are today the way the research university is organized. From this, it follows logically, and historians are never supposed to say this. We're never supposed to use logical arguments. From this, it follows logically, nonetheless, that the sixth institution, the laboratory, is destined to reinvent and repurpose the fifth, the disciplines in the research university. And to give some context for what may seem to be a bizarre claim, I'd like to back up for the last section of the talk and talk about what laboratories are and why I think they're going to take over as an institution. So the laboratory, I argue in the book, is a space. It is a physical space that originated within the Republic of Letters and later within the disciplines, chemistry, biology, etc., as a place where you can trick nature into doing unexpected things, where you can blow things up or scrutinize them under a microscope. And where it departed from all previous institutions was in acting as a conduit of artisanal skill for the hands-on craftsman's knowledge that had always been denigrated by literary scholars. Even Copernicus and Galileo had to use all those rhetorical flourishes, those literary devices, your most humble servant, oh excellency, this and that, in order to make their knowledge accepted. The laboratory proved that you didn't need any of that rhetoric. That if you could cause that test tube to blow up or turn blue or that electron pattern to spread out in a new way, you had created something regardless of the paucity of your rhetoric. In fact, even those who are judged to be constitutionally incapable of advanced thought managed to produce knowledge in this way. I refer to the female half of humanity, who as early as 1869 could be seen very actively engaged in the laboratories of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And leading women scientists like Lisa Meitner and Marie Curie, who discovered radiation, are testament to this fact. But the laboratory's claims soon expanded outside of the hard sciences per se and into society as a whole. The laboratory as an institution, not necessarily people in white coats and safety goggles, but the laboratory and its practices begin to be found elsewhere as well. And here we're talking about the creation of new physical spaces in the late 19th and early 20th century. These spaces were spawned by the twin processes of industrialization and urbanization, which threw people together in physical environments that had really not been precedented on a mass scale, at least before. There were things like the public school. There were things like the factory floor and the office building. There were things like the immigrant slum. And these were all new spaces where laboratory scientists or those inspired by laboratory techniques could take their claims to expertise and make them known. So for example, the public school became the site of the first large-scale IQ testing. The IQ test was invented by this guy, Binet, in France, but it really only caught on when you had a new sort of captive population of guinea pigs who all needed to be sorted and sifted and tested, and the feeble-minded ones shunted off into special education, and the geniuses given a leg up, even if they were the poor sons and daughters of immigrants. And this was very much believed to be a scientific laboratory-based discipline. So much so that they came up with a new scientific terminology to refer to people who had formerly been called feeble-minded. Feeble-minded is a derogatory and imprecise term. The correct term, this case referring to people with an IQ of about 70, is moron. So if you were a parent of a child and run into someone on the street, hey, who's your feeble-minded kid? Don't call him feeble-minded. You call him a moron. Yeah, he's got an IQ of 70. You see things like management consultants on the lower left. People time and motion studies designed to induce, in this case, female typists to be more productive at their jobs. The factory floor and the office building become sites of large-scale laboratory-like experimentation. You see large-scale studies of urban immigrant neighborhoods, such as this one in Chicago, where each color-coded block represents a tenement building, and the colors respond to different, that reflect different income levels. Indeed, by the mid-20th century, you see the laboratory expand its purview, its claims over the entirety of human civilization itself. With the detonation of the atom bomb, the laboratory scientists have mastered not only the tiniest space, the atom, but arrogated control over life and death itself. Unfortunately, it never came to that. My argument is that even though we now have less of a kind of naive space-age view of science as being the savior of humanity or the destroyer of humanity, as the case may be, we still look to the laboratory to solve most of our problems, our energy and environmental problems, our healthcare delivery problems, how to explain to ourselves how our own brains work. Why, genetically speaking, we love our friends and hate our enemies. These are things that are now being encroached upon by laboratory science. So I'd like to wrap up by showing you Exhibit A in the laboratory's attempt not only to organize hard science, but also to reorganize the entire domain of knowledge itself. A device in the upper left called the Memex, which, get this, was never built, but envisioned as a desktop device from which one could call up the entire knowledge of all of humanity. In this case, using microfilm and mechanical gears rather than silicon chips and LCD screens, but otherwise very similar to Google. You could even strap on this camera shown beneath it to add more information into the microfilm database. What interests me about the Memex is not the invention itself, because Google has shown that it's a lot harder to build one of these things than to just think it up. What interests me is the man, Vannevar Bush, who came up with it. And I tried to come up with dirt on Vannevar Bush like I did on Demetrius of Phaleron, the guy who dyed his hair blonde and slept with children. Adolescents, I should say. Nothing of the sort for Vannevar Bush. Your classic bespectacled, tweedy, New England engineer, nary a skeleton in the closet. But he exemplifies a key theme running throughout the book, which is that at moments of epical historical change, individuals and small communities can have an impact, can make creative changes in a way that sets a pattern for later institutions. And the road that leads from Memex to Google is a perfect illustration of this. What I'm about to say is well known and well documented. Some of you may even be able to trace these lineages yourself. So, for example, Bush's Memex article directly inspired, I believe he was in the Navy in the South Pacific at the time, a man named Douglas Engelbart, who went on to invent the computer mouse, hypertext, and online networking. It was also Vannevar Bush who gave the MIT mathematician Norbert Wiener the wartime job of automating anti-aircraft gunnery. And from this specific military technical problem, Wiener developed a comprehensive theory of man-machine interaction he called, after the Greek word for steersman, cybernetics. The idea that the human would steer, cybernetically speaking, the machine through a feedback loop. And from cybernetics comes cyberspace, which is an entire virtual domain where laboratory science now has a playground. A domain where machine logic and human consciousness can no longer be fully distinguished. A man named J.C.R. Licklider drew inspiration from both Bush and Wiener to help design automated computer networks at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, which created the ARPANET, which is well known to be the precursor to the internet. Bush's deputy during war, James Conant, the president of Harvard, popularized the SAT test to make Harvard into a meritocracy. SAT test drew on the IQ test, which was popularized in the United States by Stanford professor Lewis Terman. Lewis's son, Frederick Terman, became Vannevar Bush's student at MIT and then returned to this idyllic backwater region south of San Francisco, where he proceeded to subvert the mission of the local research university, Stanford University, by interfacing aggressively outside the ivory tower with defense contractors and local corporations. And where we stand now, Silicon Valley, is all often credited to Terman's insight that the laboratory could indeed straddle the boundaries between town and gown, as it were. Indeed, the laboratory as an institution very comfortably straddles the worlds of university research and commerce, and the brightest minds, as often as not, seek not the disciplines, but corporate installations where they can mix and marry the experimentalism of the laboratory with the entrepreneurship of the corporation in places like Google. Meanwhile, the institution I inhabit, the research university, suffers, at least in those humanistic disciplines like classics, religion, history, literature, that once were the core of learning back in the 1700s and the 1800s. Culture wars rage between postmodernists and conservatives over the now defunct canon of Western civilization. The value of pure research is diluted by the explosive growth of vocational majors like journalism and business, and by vocational universities like the University of Phoenix. And universities like my own in Oregon are overwhelmed by the sheer distraction of intercollegiate athletics, and have, in many cases, abandoned the pursuit of knowledge entirely. The present moment then invites us to speculate about the ways the laboratory will guide us out of this mess, to reinvent and reshape the practices of learning in the disciplines at the research university and lend some more coherence to them. It's not that I hope to be taken over by men and women in white coats and safety goggles. It's not that I'm calling for philosophers and historians and literary critics to develop experimental, much less quantitative models. I do fully expect that professors and students will continue to do basically what they have been doing for a good 2 centuries now. But I do fundamentally believe that we will lose our leadership function and begin to dance to the tune called by others, those who inhabit the laboratory in both of its guises, inside and outside campus walls. And that we may end up just like librarians, who continue to enjoy a vital, unmistakably important role in our society, but are also unmistakably subordinate to others in the academy as well. So in the Q&A, I'm happy to take questions, entertain insights on anything related to the book, but I'd especially be interested in your reaction to this last part of the talk about how the knowledge revolution in our own midst is causing one institution hopefully to gobble up another. Thanks for having me.
So we have the Q&A mic up front. I also have a roving mic as well.
So I wanted to get your reaction on 2 specific things. One is something we see only, well, both are things we see only today. The first is spam. There's a lot of non-knowledge which is masking itself as knowledge. Was it there in the past? How much of a problem was it? And the second is this closing of knowledge itself. There are records, government records, also public knowledge, which is being closed by the entire copyright problem. And I was just curious to get your reactions on those 2.
Yeah. I probably have more to say about spam than about private archives. And the problem that I'm sure you run into, as you've said, is that you can use You can use Google to get you can use the internet to get loads of information. Then you have to go and evaluate its credibility, whether it comes in the form of spam. Or I teach a class on the Freemasons, and people come in. I found on Google that the Freemasons killed Princess Diana. So knowledge institutions have to adapt in such a way that either is elitist, in the sense that it gives certain people trained in them the skills to distinguish raw information from true knowledge. And this, in fact, is what we do in history departments and literature departments every day. It's nothing new. And my sense then is that what's really interesting about Google and about other similar processors of knowledge is to make it more democratic. To show, as Google has done, that the page hit, it's kind of a technique, allows users of Google collectively to vote on what counts at least as the most reliable source of information on any given topic. Not necessarily the one that's the repository of truth, but that's in some ways an academic distinction. I fully expect some kind of hybrid in the future between the elitist version, teaching the skills to distinguish between true and false, and the democratic version, which capitalizes on the collective wisdom of the humanity who uses it to begin getting that process started. Sort of private knowledge has always existed. It existed in the Library of Alexandria. It was a closed space. All I would say is that the institutions that have succeeded are those that organize knowledge publicly, even if it's only for an elite section of the public. But the formal knowledge transmitted from generation to generation has always been open and public. And that's, everything else just falls by the wayside.
So I have another question. Hi, right here.
Hi.
Yeah, so the monastery had in its bounds, it was only looking at and interested in certain areas of knowledge. We say fundamentally that the monastery is about theological questions. There are some exceptions. The Talmud has medical advice in it, but the laboratory can't be used to answer ethical questions. The laboratory can't be used to answer historical questions. It's inherently forward-looking or looking at the present. So does this mean, with the laboratory taking precedence, that there are some areas of knowledge which are done?
I don't think they could ever be done, obviously. And science has historically tried to deduce ethical precepts from factual observations, leading to lots of really bad ideas, eugenics and racism, things like that. Nonetheless, I think the laboratory does carry with it a set of kind of meta-ethical principles. Democracy, experimentalism, information wants to be free, don't be evil. And these, indeed, they're never going to, supersede ethical inquiry, but they may reorganize the types of inquiry we do in philosophy or history or literature in such a way that, in some ways is in our society very unexceptionable. Democracy is the value of American society, in addition to being a core tenet of laboratory research. And we're still working out the details on that. But I do see that however many misfirings there have been so far among scientists who really try to arrogate control over the entirety of ethical and religious inquiry, that the bias towards secularism, the bias toward proof and experimentalism, democratic openness, free exchange, those are all going to be calling the tune in decades to come.
In the beginning, you said that the internet is not the biggest revolution in knowledge. Which of the institutions that you mentioned do you think does rank as the biggest?
Well, I can't take it. Craig is the one who said the knowledge revolution isn't the biggest one. I would say the one that probably the Republic of Letters would be the biggest one, because it originated on such on such a sort of shoestring budget, really from the humble origins of people just trying to get the word through these ideological battlegrounds of the university through the handwritten letter. And that spawned so many things we now take for granted, from the printed book to the museum. And so that's why I think the Renaissance is rightly celebrated as this period of incredible growth. I'm just trying to provide another explanation for why that is.
Okay. And as a follow-up, do you see the internet fitting comfortably within the laboratory institution, or to what extent might this be the beginning of something post-laboratory?
I think the internet is the culmination of the laboratory. It is a giant social experiment founded on values and tenets of democracy, openness, and freedom, which are the values of laboratory science itself. So I don't yet perceive any way in which that function might be superseded, at least by the internet. Sometime in the future, there may come some other institution that calls attention to the weaknesses of that and of other aspects of laboratory science. But I mean, the internet was created by essentially post-war defense-oriented laboratory science that then just sort of exploded into the countercultural world and then into the rest of us. So.
Hi. This isn't directly related to your talk, but it isn't entirely unrelated either. I've noticed what passes for research these days, at least outside of academia, is people look up stuff on the internet. And every once in a while I go to a library and there's just a ton of stuff there which isn't on the internet. Do you think there's a risk of stuff which doesn't make it to the internet disappearing?
I think that's up to you guys, I think, scholars often, talk about, I mean, Nicholson Baker is one that talks about the ways in which digitizing a text removes certain aspects of its physical shape and, even makes it difficult to thumb through it in a way that you would take for granted if you were sitting in a physical library building. To me, those are all valid concerns, but essentially technical obstacles that can be overcome with, sufficient technical ingenuity. You could make, except for the tactile experience, you could make, a new version of Amazon's Kindle that you can really, flip through back and forth. So yeah, I don't see any obstacles there in the long run.
So you think the direction is everything is going to go onto the internet. It's not that people will keep using physical libraries.
I think I'll back up and say it'll take decades before that happens. Okay. So the physical buildings of libraries aren't going to go away anytime soon. I think what's more likely to happen, and has perhaps already happened, is that the internet has destroyed people's way of reading, at least people who have been brought up on a book culture. But even then, I see that as a technical problem to be circumvented by crafty history professors. And I can't claim to have solved the problem yet, but it's going to be the task of my generation.
And I mentioned this theory once to a friend of mine, and he said it had already happened a long time ago when everything that didn't get translated into Latin got lost. Is he right, or is he been way out in left field?
It depends on what in particular you're referring to. I mean, there's there's a couple different routes to make it from ancient to modern, and Latin is one, Arabic is another. But most of the knowledge we use now in the West was at least translated from Greek into Arabic and then into Latin. But there are Arabic texts out there that haven't yet been rendered into Latin that reflected some layer, some level, a more ancient inheritance.
Thanks.
Sure.
Other questions? All right, well, I just had one question to close out our talk today. Ian, I know in our lunch this morning you mentioned moving into a more world history perspective, and so I was wondering if you could comment briefly about the development of these spheres in sort of the worldwide quest for knowledge in addition to the Western European quest.
Yeah, one idea I have, because 2,300 years wasn't enough, was to do a global version of this book. And in the book, I talk about China, India, and Islam as the three major rivals or alternatives to the West. And there's actually an analog in each one for every single institution except the laboratory, which becomes the foundation for Western hegemony over the other worlds of learning. But I think that there are practices, spiritual practices, philosophical practices, ways of dividing up and organizing knowledge that need to be retrieved from the historical record in China, India, and Islam, and beyond. But those are the big players. So, one idea, and I'm taking suggestions, is to make that the basis for the sequel, essentially.
Great. Well, we thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure having you.
Great. Thanks very much.